Strategy. Okay, this is, I think, my fourth attempt to introduce this material, and I hope that I will do slightly better at trying to keep within time and cover the ground than I have in the past three, but my apologies if I don't. It certainly is absolutely not intended to be the last word. Its primary purpose actually is to open up questions and perhaps hopefully actually to slay some sacred cows. The context of my writing this stuff, the immediate context of my starting out on writing it was the debate in the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire on revolutionary strategy and the terrible texts by Antoine Artus and Cédric Durand in that debate, and Alex Kounikos's dreadful dogmatist response to these terrible texts. But the real context is, as the subtitle makes plain, the problem of unity of the left. Now, side one of this problem is we've had series nationally and internationally of unity projects which follow the idea which the Mandelites developed in the 1980s of a unitary party, quote, not delimited between reform and not programmatically delimited between reform and revolution, of which supposedly the first example was the Brazilian Workers' Party. Since then we've had Rifondazione, the Scottish Socialist Party, and of course in a certain sense the Respect Project, the Socialist Alliance Project, more seriously the Respect Project and the Socialist Alliance Project were both variants of this idea. And what's clear, it seems to me, is that this sort of projects of this sort have proved disastrous. That you wind up coming out of them with fewer forces and less morale than you went into them. And that's actually not just true of the revolutionaries. It's also true of the reformists who go into projects of this sort. Witness Rifondazione. They wind up, Bertinotti and his immediate co-thinkers have wound up with fewer forces and less morale than they went into Rifondazione, considered as a unity project. Side two, however, of this problem of left unity is the concept of the, quote, revolutionary party, unquote, aka a Bolshevik-Leninist party, aka a Trotskyist party, aka a Marxist-Leninist party, and the concept which actually Steve Freeman, who isn't here, polemicized with me about this in pages of the Weekly Worker in another debate, that there can be, quote, no revolutionary party without revolutionary theory, an expression drawn from Lenin's What Is to Be Done, grossly overread by most far leftists to mean that you can't have an organization without agreement on questions of theory, so that we couldn't have an organization, common organization, unless we all agreed with the theory of permanent revolution. Not just with the programmatic conclusion of the theory of conclusions of the theory of the permanent revolution, which is that the working class must try and take power, and that the revolution has to spread itself internationally. But with the theory of permanent revolution, or we must all agree on the Socialist Workers' Party claims to be, though God knows I have no idea how it can be at the present day, based on Tony Cliff's theory of state capitalism. And the leaders of the SWP will say that Tony Cliff's theory of state capitalism enabled the Socialist Workers' Party to avoid the degeneration of the orthodox Trotskyist groups, claim which frankly rings extremely hollow at the present day. The consequence of this conception of a revolutionary party, there can be no revolutionary party without revolutionary theory. The party is based on agreement to drawn out systematized theory, and also of the bureaucratic centralist character of the party is inability to unite and dispersal of forces. A wonderful recent example is David Broder's recent exit from the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, holding dissenting positions on the question of the occupation of Iraq, and holding, in fact, what is formally the majority position of the AWL passed at its last conference, that the AWL would oppose any military, imperialist or Israeli military action against Iraq. Iran, sorry. He criticised Sean McGamner's scummy, scabby article on the question of Iran, and they haul him in front of the Star Chamber meeting and accuse him of being an agent either for the CPGB or for Workers' Power. Somehow they seem to be unable to distinguish the political positions of the CPGB and Workers' Power on these questions, and demand that he give a loyalty statement, a statement of his loyalty to the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, to be approved by Sean McGamner and then published in the press. And when he objects to this course of action, they accuse him of having the centrist and anarchist critique of the Bolshevik, of the Trotskyist tradition, which has two characteristics. The first of which is its extraordinary classic Healeyism. This is, Sean was once a member of Jerry Healey's Socialist Labour, Sean McGamner was once a member of Jerry Healey's Socialist Labour League, and it shows. It's extraordinary classic Healeyism. It's also comes within, I think, 2 weeks, it may be 3 weeks, of the AWL publishing in its press an article, Left Unity, but why can't the left, isn't the left united? In which they explain that the left is not united because of bureaucratic centralism and the suppression of dissent. And that the openness, in contrast, the openness and freedom of dissent of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty makes it possible for, on the basis of the AWL's approach, to build unity. The reality, in fact, is that behind a facade of openness, the AWL is a cult round the person of Sean McGamner, just as the Workers' Revolutionary Party was at the end of their cult round the person of Jerry Healey. And so there are umpteen far-left organisations, including international organisations, which are cults round the person of some maximum leader, whether it's Juan Posadas, relatively recently deceased, or Jorge Altamira, or Guillermo Laura, or Nahuel Moreno, or Jerry Healey, or Tony Cliff, or blah, 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 blah. We go. Pierre Lambert, recently deceased, or we could go on forever. Now, I should make clear, because Hillel raised a point in an earlier discussion this week, that I am not saying that without the fundamental errors on the party question and organisational norms, there would be no splits in the workers' movement or in the far left, in the organised far left. That is obviously not the case. What I'm saying is that with the errors on the party question, it is transparently clear that there cannot avoid being splits which are completely and utterly unprincipled. And a paradox, actually, an example from the unity movements. Who the hell can draw a political line and say there is a political difference between the Scottish Socialist Party and Solidarity Scotland? Where's the political difference? It's invisible. It's just about Tommy Sheridan and the so-called scabs who testified against him. Who could say after in the London May elections that there was a political difference between Respect Renewal on the other side and Respect the Left Alternative run by the SWP on the other? You look at the platforms of the two tendencies, and virtually nothing divided them. It was just about who ran the show, George Galloway or John Rees. And many splits have that character. Many failures to unite have that character. The American Socialist Workers' Party in the middle 1980s abandoned Trotskyism and became enthusiasts for Castro's Cuba, and more generally actually went through and systematically critiqued. They wrote a fat book called Their Trotsky and Ours, which recapitulated all the standard official communist criticisms of Trotsky. Fine. So why didn't they join the CPUSA? Or equally, why didn't they fuse with the Workers' World Party, which had very similar point of view? Sectarianism. Okay, the failure of the projects of unity not programmatically delimited between reform and revolution indicates that there are real political differences between, quote, reformists and, quote, revolutionaries. Things which divide us from standard bureaucrats. Okay, the gas split with Galloway was totally apolitical, but the underlying questions which the SWP then picked up on, stuff which was on the AWL's website or on our website, about should you enter into coalitions with the bourgeoisie or sections of the petty bourgeoisie, or should MPs be restricted to a worker's wage, or should they be MPs be accountable and responsive to the party? These are real political issues. The split in Rifondazione and the collapse of Rifondazione is unambiguously about political issues. It's about what's your attitude to your own country's wars, and again about entry into coalition government. The dispersal of forces on the far left, on the other hand, endless splits, sectarianism, petty tyrants, Jerry Healy as a small Stalin, and Sean Macnair as an even smaller Jerry Healy, indicates that there is something wrong, points to the conclusion that there is something wrong with the package of ideas common to Marxist-Leninists, Bolshevik-Leninists, Trotskyists, etc. Which isn't simply a problem with Pabloism, or even simply, as one of the Polish Revolution comrades said to me, it's simply a problem with post-war Trotskyism. I'd say it's not simply a problem with post-war Trotskyism, although it is actually true that the pre-war Trotskyist movement was a great deal more open and democratic than the post-war Trotskyist movement. But the fact is actually that comrades who have set out to build new Trotskyist organizations on the basis of the formal political basis of Trotskyism, that is the first four congresses of the Comintern plus the texts of the International Left Opposition and International Communist League and the founding conference of the Fourth International, have come up with the same goddamn bureaucratic and at the end of the day opportunist policy as people who place themselves firmly within the traditions of the movement established in 1946. When we find that we're lost, we have to retrace our steps to try and find out where we went wrong. And by God, the left and the Marxist, self-identified Marxist left and the far left is as of 2008 lost. And that's really what the project of this book is. Or put it that one way, to retrace our steps and find out where we went wrong. Put it another way, after 1991, before 1991, it was a very common thing to say about, on the far left, that 1917 was the only successful example of a workers' revolution. And that it was for that reason that we had to take the fundamental lines of our politics from the Russian Revolution. Now, we could say that we were taking the fundamental lines of our politics from the Russian Revolution in the form of the first four congresses of the Comintern, which was the Trotskyist starting point. Yeah. Or we could say that it was a matter of being Leninist or Marxist-Leninist, yeah, rather different forms of expression. Yeah. But in either case, what we were doing was taking the Russian Revolution as a model. Now, it was always rather questionable to suppose that the Russian Revolution, which is a revolution in a very backward country, a country which had a small concentration of major industry, a proletariat of about 10% of the population, and the vast bulk of the country living in economic productive conditions far more comparable to rural Africa today than it was perhaps comparable to 12th century Europe, not 16th or 17th century Europe. It was an extraordinary idea that the revolution in Russia, in that sense, was going to give a model to countries which had majority proletariat, intense industry, elaborated functional bureaucratic state, which the Tsarist regime had tried to have a bureaucratic state, but it was an extraordinary failure. These are different social conditions. So after 91, however, it's clear, unambiguously clear, that at the end of the day, the Russian Revolution ended in historical defeat. Now, actually, most Trotskyists and most leftists who are non-Stalinists would say, well, the revolution was actually defeated in the 1920s with the rise of Stalinism. Yeah. But perhaps we could borrow from what was earlier. I don't think that was actually what Trotsky thought. Yeah, he clearly thought that the revolution had been a success in the same sense that the English Civil War had overthrown feudalism, but there had been a political counter-revolution in 1660, and then there was a political revolution which brought the political regime into line with the social dynamics in 1688. Or similarly, in France, there was a social revolution in 1789 to 99, political counter-revolution both in 1799 when Napoleon took power, and then again more severely in 1815, and political revolutions, a series of political revolutions in the 19th century brought this political order in France into alignment with the capitalist social order. That's what Trotsky meant by political revolution. But the problem was there was no objective dynamic in the Soviet Union, or indeed the Eastern European states or anywhere else, towards the working class taking power. What there was an objective dynamic towards was capitalism. And that the absence of an objective dynamic towards the working class taking power made it impossible for Trotskyists or other oppositionists to actually build party organizations which could lead any workers' movement which developed. Because party organizations, workers' organizations, even small ones, are built out of an intersection between a radicalizing section of the semi-proletarianized petty bourgeoisie, the people, socialist ideas, whatever the hell you like to call it, and on the other hand, the workers' vanguard, that is the militants who become active, permanently active in defense of the workers' immediate interests in trade unions, general workers' political parties, and so on and so forth. If it weren't for the fact that the working class tends to throw up powerful organizations to conduct the day-to-day class struggle against capitalism, socialists would be no more than the small utopian groups which existed before the workers' movement came into existence. This is actually ABC elementary Marxism. It's unfortunately obscured by an error. Lenin, three sources and three component parts of Marxism. He's left out the fourth source and fourth component part of Marxism, which is actually the most important, which is Chartism. Marxism is more than anything else, a response to the emergence of an organised political workers' movement in the form of Chartism, which attempts to give theory to that, both, as I said, then it is true that the theory comes from French utopian socialism and from political economy and from German philosophy, but the Chartism is actually at the heart and centre of it. Okay, so the workers' movement is at the heart and centre of it, and in the USSR and in the Stalinist states, the objective dynamics which create permanent class struggle over the wage relation between the bosses and the workers, and therefore create permanent workers' organisations, weren't there. Now, we can have any number of explanations of why it weren't there, except it's clearly not state capitalism. It's manifestly the case that it is not state capitalism. And there are different explanations. Hillel has one view, I have another view, there are a number of different people, but essentially what it comes down to is it's clearly the case, and the evidence is transparent. The reason why no Trotskyist organisations were built in the East is not betrayal and refusal to attempt to build Trotskyist organisations in the East, and Pavlovism or anything like that. Because the Trotskyists, the leaders of the Trotskyist movement, didn't dispose of preventing people from splitting. The failure to build in the East is due to the absence of the objective dynamic of class struggle between workers and bosses, which is the underlying ground of the possibility of socialism. So, in that sense, 91 at the end of the day is the proof, the final proof of that fact. And it finally proved in that this turns out to be, at the end of the day, a distorted, a long detour on the road from feudalism to capitalism. A blocked and abortive, John has used the phrase, an ectopic society, something which goes nowhere. Well, if it ends up with something which goes nowhere, and it was already the case by the middle 1920s that the overwhelming probability was going to be that it was going to end up with something going nowhere, we cannot treat 1917 as the model for all socialist as the model for workers' revolutions across the globe. So, back to the beginning, and that's really what I'm trying to do with this. Back to the beginning, what among the positions of, the traditional positions of the left are justified on the basis of the elementary ideas of Marxism and the evidence of history, and what among these traditional ideas of the left are merely inheritances from just doing what the Russians told us to do. I start then I've spent half an hour on this already, but to very much summarise, what I claim in the first place is that the basic ideas of Marx and Engels for political strategy, the centre of Marxism is a set of claims about political strategy. And this is that the working class can only emancipate itself by struggling for communism, and that the communism can only be achieved as a result of the political struggle of the working class, that it's a question of working class politics, and that the central task is working class independent political organisation. Secondly, that means political organisation. This is Marx versus Proudhon on the one hand and Bakunin on the other. That the working class can't simply build up cooperatives and by building up a cooperative movement gradually displace capitalism. That was perhaps less obvious in the 1870s. It should be utterly and completely transparent now, though I know Arthur Boff on his blog has tried to revive this idea of the cooperative movement. The capitalism exercises power and controls power through the state. The working class has to take political action. It has to take action which identifies its common interests as a class, and moreover, which attempts to impose its common interest as a class on the society as a whole. And it can only do that not by simply industrial action, by building cooperatives, but by political action in the struggle for general laws, in the struggle to take over and replace the state. Going along with that, it's a line of radical democracy, which is actually what replaces the state is radical democracy. That replaces the bourgeois state is radical democracy. This is absolutely clear in Marx and Engels' writings. It's not a question that they don't know of the way in which the bourgeois parties politically expropriate the working class. They're not thinking about it as a syndical activity, as Bakunin is thinking about it as a syndical activity, because they're thinking about the working class as the whole social class, which stands in a inherited position of separation from the means of production. So not just the people who are currently in work, let alone the people who are currently in productive work or industrial work, but also the unemployed, the pensioners, the youth. Yeah? So the working class, for working class independent political action, independent of and against the existing bourgeois state, for radical democracy, and international in character. Clear in the First International, equally clear in the critique of the Goethe program. The present tasks of the working class are international in scope, that the workers' movement needs to organise and build internationally before seizing power. It's not a matter of a brotherhood of peoples in the indefinite future. Are these fundamental political axes of Marxism confirmed or disconfirmed by the course of events since then? I would argue, I'm not going to argue it at length, but it seems to me it's transparently the case that they're confirmed. It's clearly the case that they're confirmed. Both at the level of class, it's obvious that populism and worker-peasant alliances and socialism without class politics and all of this crap leads nowhere, or at most to Stalinism. Political action versus non-political action and strike action only. Again, we have an anarchist movement, we've had an anarchist movement on and off. The anarchist movement pushes forward this non-party, direct action, networks of association and so on and so forth. Most recently the social forum movement, and we had Comrade Boris Kagalitsky's discussion of the crisis of the social forum movement, which precisely illustrated, that's the most recent example, that this is hopeless. International in character, again, we live in the epoch, second epoch of globalization. Whatever the hell. It's made utterly transparent. And Zimbabwe is a classic example of this. I don't buy the bourgeoisie's representation of Robert Mugabe as a mad tyrant, etc. The problem underlying is that Mugabe was absolutely determined to carry through the land reform which the British were determined to prevent him from doing, and the British control too many levers. Each individual country is too interlocked in the international relations of production for it to be possible for the working class to take power in a single country and hold it for more than a period of months without extending the revolution. The illusion that it was otherwise was created by two things, one of which was the period of semi-autarkic world empires, that the British Empire had a imperial protection system, the French Empire had an imperial protection system, partly by the fact that precisely that Russia was, and China was also, a peasant majority country which was self-sufficient in food and only limitedly integrated in the world market. You know. And that made it possible to have an autarkic regime, albeit bloody unpleasant autarkic regime, seriously not something that anybody would regard as being an advance on capitalism as it exists. So the basic grounds of Marx's arguments, Marx and Engels' arguments, it seems to me, retain full force. Then I look at the political strategies of the Second International, and I identify very broadly a right wing, a centre and a left. The right wing is the coalitionists. They come from, background is Lassalle's informal coalition with Bismarck against the bourgeoisie. Yeah. But it's Volmar, Bernstein and co. And what they're essentially arguing is we've got to create a government which can give us immediate reforms. There are good reasons for supposing that you can't get much in the way of immediate reforms without forming a government. Because of the parliamentary structure, it gives governments essentially a lot of control over the parliamentary agenda. But we've got, in order to create a government, we're going to have to enter into, we're a minority, so we're going to have to enter into coalition with the radical left parties of the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie. In order to enter into coalition with the left parties of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, we've got to not scare them. And not scaring them means not talking about revolution, the overthrow of the state, or for that matter about capitalism, cycles and crisis and so on and so forth. This policy, in a sense, worked. I mean, you can see it in a sense. Labour governments in the past have delivered reforms for the benefit of sections of the British working class. SPD governments have delivered reforms for the benefit of sections of the German working class, and so on and so forth. The trouble is that in the world economy, a nation state is a firm, a competing firm. So if you're going to make, what it comes down to, if you're going to make labour power more expensive for British capitalists by concessions to the British workers, you've got to pass off those costs onto somebody else, other states, weaker states. Reformism inherently carries with it imperialism, nationalism and imperialism, because precisely you're going for reform through government. So whatever sentimental objections you may have to imperialism, at the end of the day, it's bloody hands forever. And the British Labour Party is perhaps one of the most classic examples of that. An imperialist party from its beginning and through to the present day. Secondly, you're a competing firm in the world market. Laying off the costs externally doesn't work forever. Sooner or later you come back to international crisis. International crisis brings the chickens home to roost. And reformism stops working, which we have actually got again. You can see it at episodic different periods of time. Thirdly, actually, workers are no more keen than anybody else on having their lives micromanaged. That's what a hell of a lot of industrial disputes are about, is tyranny. Not just about bread and butter, but about tyranny. And reformism through the state, labourism, for example, means extending the state power in order to regulate more and more. And what it throws up, therefore, is working class support for right-wing parties which offer liberty. That's actually, in some senses, that's what happened to the Soviet Union. That people were willing to vote for right-wing parties who wanted liberty, because they didn't want this tyranny over them of totalitarian atomization and the KGB everywhere. But it's exactly the same thing when the petty tyrannies of the council house manager lead people to think that it's a great idea to buy the council houses as private houses and therefore to vote Tory. And we can see the electoral cycle of all the advanced capitalist countries. Each time you get reformist government, the next time is weaker. Each time you get reformist government, the next time the right-wing surge against it is stronger. So the underlying dynamic of this is one which we should be all familiar with, that reformism is at the end of the day, is a catastrophe on its own terms. On the other hand, Bakunin. And from Bakunin's ideas we get the syndicalists and Sorel. And Sorel's ideas are profoundly influential on Rosa Luxemburg and somewhat less influential on Trotsky, and certainly influential on Bogdanov and a whole load of people of the Hermann Gorter, Korsch, the people who were the left wing of the Second International and the left communists in the left and council communists in the 1920s. Their descendants in modern times are the libertarian communists, the anti-party leftists, the anarchists, etc., etc., etc. Now, this tendency said the trouble with taking political working class organising for political action is that you're going to get a bureaucracy. They called it, Bakunin called it, a bourgeoisie, a new bourgeoisie of communists, a new bourgeoisie of Marxists. And therefore, if you do this, then the result is going to be it's no point. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is the general strike. Why? When the workers are on strike, now the bureaucracy is subordinated, or can be subordinated. It's possible to throw up strike committees, and strike committees can subordinate the bureaucracies, and strikers can go and picket other factories out and develop networks of horizontal communication, Soviets as is familiar, and so on and so forth. And therefore, if we do it all in one act with the general strike, we can avoid the problem of bureaucracy. Okay, it doesn't have to be the original advocates of the general strike said we should all save up our wages, and one day the trade union, the big trade union, the IWW or whatever it is, will call the general strike and everybody will go out.
For 1 month. For 1 month general strike, that's what they...
Yeah, for 1 month. Sort of bizarre idea. What if everybody's on strike? What the hell uses your money to buy food? Because if everybody's on strike, if you really have an effective general strike in Britain today, the electrical power shuts off, there's no light, there's no petrol in the petrol stations, there's, the railways are shut down, no food is being delivered to the supermarkets, in fact the supermarkets are shut down, no food is being delivered to the corner shops because the delivery drivers are on strike, blah, 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 blah. So the reality is, actually, a general strike immediately poses the question of an alternative form of authority, that the working class has to actually create a new government. What the hell's a government? Well, a government involves people, among others, not just a decision-making mechanism, but also people who accumulate information and people who communicate information, clerks, statisticians, bureaucrats. So that actually the idea that the general strike escapes from the problem of the bureaucracy is a complete illusion. And that's actually just as much true. Luxembourg said it's okay, it's not going to be the all-out 1 month general strike, it's going to be an overlapping strike wave. But actually overlapping strike waves also disrupt the economy. We can see it even actually in a very small strike, Grangemouth, there was a real threat. The bourgeoisie was really quite scared that petrol supplies were going to be disrupted by this single sector strike. The big miners' strikes in 72 and 74, power cuts, shutdowns, 3-day, what was it, 3-day week?
Yeah.
Yeah, 3-day week.
Can we have the 3-day week again?
Yeah, I don't think anybody was desperately worried about the 3-day week. But the point is simply there is real disruption of the economy. Yeah? Now, if this actually goes on for a period of time, what broad masses demand is some government which will restore the broken up connections. Yeah? And what usually happens actually is the right wing comes in, or the army comes in and says, right, we're going to stop this stuff, we're going to use military force. But it can be the case that a left-wing government comes in, or it can be the case that the Social Democrats are put in power and restore order and hand it back to the capitalist class. But you've got to have decision-making mechanisms. The Bolsheviks thought that they had a solution to this problem in the form of all power to the Soviets. The Soviets are strike committees, therefore they're not bureaucratic, and by coordinating the Soviets, you can have an alternative decision-making mechanism. They took power. What happened? The civil servants went on strike against the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks suddenly discovered that without the civil servants, they actually had no means of deciding what decisions ought to be made, of making any sense of the decomposition of the Russian economy. So they had to make political concessions to the civil servants in order to bring them back to work, and combine that with having a load of people holding guns on them to make them work, i.e. the checker. So they had to have a bureaucracy, and they had to have a secret police, and in that is the germ of, not yet the actuality, but the germ of what later became Stalinism. So that the reality, therefore, is that the leap to the Soviet form was an illusion, and we've seen it elsewhere that the leap to the Soviet form was an illusion in much more advanced countries. The Austrian Räte, the German Räte, wind up asking the social democratic leaders what to do. Reason: they still need a national coordinating authority. There's a need for a government. So that the strategy of the left is an illusion. The general strike strategy, the strategy of the insurrectionary general strike, the strategy of creating Soviets and all power to the Soviets is an illusion. The centre tendency in the Second International mostly identified with Kautsky, but actually Lenin before 1914 and the Bolsheviks before 1914 were unequivocally a part of the centre tendency. They were the people who were bringing Kautskyism to Russia. The basic idea is that you build up the organised movement of the working class, that the organised movement of the working class increasingly develops an independent policy at national and international level, and that it increasingly asserts that policy both by in electoral activity and in strike activity and in all the other various forms of political activity that are possible. But that it's organised, the old slogan, educate, agitate, organise, organise is the heart and centre of this strategy. In my opinion, the central core of that strategy, without that central core of that strategy, no Russian revolution, because no mass Bolshevik party. You have to be a Kautskyan on the question of organising and educate, agitate, organise, as opposed to agitate, 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 to get to the point of having a mass workers' party, which can possibly pose the question of power. But, downside. First off, Kautsky and the Kautskians utterly abandoned Marx on the state. They came to believe, they recognized that there had to be a bureaucracy. Correctly, they recognized there had to be a bureaucracy in the sense of bureaus, officials, specialists. And then they said, well, this is going to be just the same for the workers as for the capitalists. We're just going to take over the existing capitalist civil service army apparatus, and so on and so forth. And of course, the consequence of that is that they wind up subordinating themselves to the existing capitalist state apparatus. Secondly, they were nationalists. They did what Marx and Engels blamed Lassalle and the Lassallians for, postponing the international to an indefinite future of the Brotherhood of Peoples. And that came home to roost in 1914 when the Kautskians wound up backing the nation states in the war. Okay, that then, my conclusion then out of that, very broadly, is we need what we need for the moment is a Kautskian strategy, a strategy of organising, of educate, agitate, organise, a strategy of patience, but one which is clear on the question of the state, is for radical democratic subordination of a state, that a state bureaucracy will continue to exist, but we need to subordinate it to the working class. And it's also clear that internationalism is a task for now, it's not a task for after the revolution. The working class needs to organise internationally before taking power. Right now the working class needs to organise internationally, and socialists need to fight for radical internationalism. Where am I?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Okay, I have, as usual, said more on the first part of this than I've said on the latter parts of it. After the First World War, the socialist movement split between socialists and communists. The Euro-communists claimed that we can undo that split, and of course all that happened was they simply became social democrats. Or indeed they became usually not just social democrats, but right-wing social democrats, or more right-wing than social democrats. The split is real, the split is unavoidable. But the reasoning about it, and all the reasoning around it, I think is skewed and problematic in a series of ways. First off, it seems to me Lenin's argument for revolutionary defeatism in the conditions of World War I is correct. Hal Draper is wrong on this, because he misunderstands what Lenin's argument is. His argument is that the parties on both sides of the war should agitate in the armed forces to get the soldiers to simultaneously turn their guns on their officers and march on their home capitals to take power. That's what Lenin is proposing to the Second International. And there is also the underlying principle. You have to prepare for that, and you have to prepare for that well in advance by teaching the movement, extending to the movement the understanding that our state is our enemy. The main enemy is at home. So defeatism, and this is, we've been fighting with Sean Macnair. We don't think defeatism implies CPGB. We don't think defeatism for Britain. We are for the defeat of Britain in Iraq or in any adventure in Iran, however unlikely it is to happen. We're for the defeat of Britain. That doesn't require us to be in favour of the victory of whoever the British happen to be fighting against, any more than to be for the defeat of Russia required being for the victory of the Kaiser, or to be for the defeat of the Kaiser required being for the victory of the Tsar. The party of a new type. There are two. The split is given two justifications. One part is the idea that a split will purge the movement and get rid of scabs. But it's not just that it'll get rid of the open scabs. I'm quite happy to have the idea that Sean Macnair should be purged from the British Workers' Movement. He's a scab. I don't think it follows from that, actually, that every member of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty should be purged from the British Workers' Movement because he gives cover to Sean Macnair. Moreover, purging an individual from the movement because he's an immediate scab, you know, doesn't actually get rid of the problem of reformism. Manifest. The Bolsheviks were separate. This is particular S.W. Pearson. You need a party of organisationally separate of revolutionaries. And this is shown by 1903 and the Bolsheviks in 1917. Well, excuse me, in 1917, Lenin came back to Petrograd and found Kamenev and Stalin negotiating for Bolshevik support for the provisional government and reunification with the Mensheviks. And in October 1917, Zinoviev and Kamenev denounced the planned insurrection in the bourgeois press. Yeah. So it's hardly the case that having split purified the party and prevented reformist and opportunist tendencies developing. The second idea was the Bolshevik Party is a party of a whole new type, and there are a variety of reasons which may be given for its being of a whole new type, but in the most systematic form, it's in the theses of the Third World Congress of the Comintern, written by Zinoviev, which is a type which is characterized by military top-down control, which is utterly contrary to the character of the Bolshevik Party as it was before the seizure of power, or even as it was down through 1918. The consequence is we've got a form of party, Zinoviev, Cannon, etc., all these people. This form of party is actually a form of party which can represent the peasantry. You can see that with Mao and with most recently with the Nepali communists. That it's a party which can represent the peasantry because it's a form of party which is created in the effort of the Bolsheviks to represent the peasantry in the Civil War. It expresses the class interest of the peasantry, not the class interest of the proletariat. So this form of party is actually useless to the working class and positively dangerous to the working class. Then, in turn, the militarist form of party means that the policy of the United Front is corrupted. We have had a split in the workers' movement, an unavoidable split in the workers' movement. It's unavoidable because the scabs of the social democracy are backed up by the bourgeois state and the bourgeois intelligence apparat and repression against the left and constantly bring forward ultimatums against the left. So split is unavoidable, but we should be able to have unity in action within the framework of recognising that there are fundamental principal differences. But we can't have it, and the reason why we can't have it is because nobody can imagine a party of the militarised, top-down militarised type which bans factions really believing in unity in action while combining it with the expression of principal differences. And indeed, the people don't believe in it themselves. They zigzag between the idea that in order to get unity we have to shut up about our principles, which respect is a wonderful example of, which is Dimitrov on the United Front and Dimitrov on the People's Front and blah, blah, blah. Or on the other hand, because we have differences about our principles, we can't unite, which the British left at the moment in relation to the Labour Party. We have at the moment an extraordinary right-wing form of third-period Stalinism on the British far left. So that the United Front is a brilliant idea, and the stuff that most of what's written on it by Lenin and Trotsky is entirely, stuff we can really learn from. But it's inconsistent with the theses on the nature of the party, and that inconsistency has the result that the theory can't, that the United Front can't be applied. The extreme example of that is the thesis on the workers' government. This is a slogan which is constantly used. The reality is that the theses of the Third and Fourth World Congress on the workers' government are hopelessly vague and indeterminate, and the result is that the slogan becomes either empty and propagandist or pure opportunism. And back to the final chapter of the book is simply on the question of the international. Again, this concept of the military top-down party produces the military top-down International and the General Staff of the World Revolution, which is to be the Oberhauptskommando Wehrmacht for the World Revolution, precisely a militaristic conception. And that militaristic conception carries with it that the Executive Committee of the Comintern, for example, thinks it's appropriate to give direct instructions to the PCF about reorganisation of the same federation. What the hell? It's a sort of, I can see it's familiar why it's going on. It's part of the process of the political split with the centre. Yeah? But the idea that it could be appropriate for an international leading body to give instructions, say that you must reorganise one of your regional branches of a national party. Now, talk about micromanagement. And going along with that, again in the Third World Congress theses, any member of the Central Committee who happens to be present in a branch or cell has the right of veto. Why? There are really, there is the consequence of that, the consequence of this conception of the General Staff of the World Revolution, the other side of it is everything is to be hub and spokes. It's to be the relations of the individual party with the centre. You're not allowed to have bilateral or multilateral horizontal relations between the national parties, because that might disrupt the unity of the international. Which means, of course, that you can't have practical collaboration of the communist parties in Europe or the communist parties in Latin America. The only collaboration which can exist is between the national parties and the centre. And where this leads to is actually against, fundamentally back to Lassalle, against Marx's and Engels' conception that the struggle of the working class is from the outset and openly international. Yeah? So that just finally, this process, I won't say in any sense, to go right back to the beginning, this is not intended to be the last word. It's intended to open up discussions, perhaps to slay some sacred cows. Yeah. The fundamentals of Marx's strategy are correct. Much of what's been laid on top of them as orthodox communism, orthodox Trotskyism, Maoism, blah, 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 is untrue and is demonstrably untrue.
Okay, thank you very much.
I guess probably the thing which has come back and back again is the issue of the Soviets and the slogan of all power to the Soviets. And there are two issues which are actually involved in that. And the first is, what would be the appropriate form of decision-making mechanisms in circumstances where, let's say, take it, where in circumstances where we seize power in Europe. Yeah? And the question is, should it be workplace-based committees, and this point Moshe made, workplace-based committees delegate to local committees, which delegate to regional committees, which delegate to national committees, and there's dilution at each stage. I've actually experienced that in a small trot organisation. The IMG International Marxist Group elected a central committee of, it was an organisation of 600, and it elected a central committee of 60 members, and the central committee elected a political committee of 40 members, and the political committee elected a political bureau of, I think, 21 members. And then under the norms of the IMG, the decisions of the political bureau about how political bureau members should vote in political committee meetings were binding on their members. And the decisions of political committee on how political committee members should vote in central committee meetings were binding on their members in the central committee. And at the end of the day, were you aware of this in the period when you were in the those norms continued in the ISG? Yeah. At the end of the day, actually, this is a structure which appears to be democratic and indeed allowed very considerable within the minority, the 30% minority of the Central Committee who weren't on the one-third minority in the Central Committee who weren't on the political committee, you could automatically represent oppositions. But in reality, the whole thing was completely bureaucratic. Okay, actually, surprisingly, this is not the constitution of the RSFSR, as Peter pointed out. The constitution of the RSFSR is city soviets, which are local councils elected by universal suffrage, with the exclusion that if you weren't, that you couldn't vote if you were capable of working and not in work. Yeah. So that if you were living off other people, unemployed or living off other people, you didn't get a vote. Yeah. And then the city delegates elected to the Congress. Now they also had a mechanism which was much more complex, where the village in the countryside elected to the Uyezd Soviet, and the Uyezd Soviet elected to the Gubernia Soviet, and the Gubernia Soviet elected to the something else Soviet, and that elected to the Supreme Soviet. Yeah, so that you really diluted the votes of the peasantry. I think that was actually deliberate. They intended to dilute the votes of the peasantry as opposed to the city dwellers. Yeah. But in either case, this is 1918. Yeah, this is not the bureaucracy. This is the revolutionary leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The revolutionary leadership of the Bolshevik Party adopts this precisely because it's clear in the section on the franchise that they're aware of it, that old age pensioners, people who are disabled by illness, and homemakers, women who aren't in employment because they're bringing up kids, etc., unwaged homemakers, are part of the working class. And therefore, the implication of that is that a pure workplace system of representation would be disenfranchising. Now, actually, they also had factory committees, elected factory committees, and God knows what else, elected block. Tenants had the elected block committee for their housing block, or street committee, stuff like that. Masses of these organisational forms running in parallel, but the sovereignty is in the elected Soviets, which in practice actually could equally well be called communes or local authorities or boroughs. It's a point Tom made and relates to the point Moshe made. My preference actually is for something like, this is just my judgment about it, my preference is for something like that. My reason for that is that I think recallability is important, and if you have direct election to a parliament from geographical single-member constituencies, etc., it's hard to arrange recallability. And indeed, I think actually the bourgeoisie took away the right of recall which had existed in the borough constituencies. The Reform Act of 1832 extends the franchise, but the price of extending the franchise is that they also, at the same time, remove the legal accountability of the MPs which had existed before the Reform Act.
In Britain?
In Britain, yeah. So I prefer to say that the cities, we elect to the city council and the city elects to the national body, not more than two-tier, and with that, all the other institutions existing as parallel. But the underlying point is principles. The principle of accountability, the principle of answerability from below, the principle of responsibility to those below, transparency, absence of state secrets, absence of party secrets, absence of government confidentiality, and Central Committee confidentiality. In my view, term limits, this is not a majority view in the CPGP, or certainly not one we've adopted, that you can't stay in a full-time position, elected position, for more than a fixed period of time. Militia, armed, right to keep and bear arms, universal jury trial. I don't think the idea that the Soviets were going to jury is important as part of Republican principles. Freedom of parties, freedom of the press, abolition of copyright, patents, blah, 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 blah. In relation to the resistance of the bourgeoisie, my understanding of the Democratic Republic as Marx and Engels presented is it involves the nationalisation of the banks, complete nationalisation of the banks and the financial system, and the expropriation of the landed property and investments of the church, as minimum. So that you're actually taking hold of the spinal core of capitalist plan. Now, in relation to other nationalisations, it seems to me, where we are now, it's totally pointless to it's totally unjustifiable to have private ownership of natural monopolies like the railways and water, telecommunications, blah, blah, blah. So that republicanism, what republicanism is about here, is about self-government by the people who work in the industry in consultation with the people who consume in the industry, and again the same principles: no management secrets, term limits, recallability in terms of the management structure of these institutions. So the formula, the point of using the formula democratic republicanism, in my opinion, is that it's first it's Marx and Engels, but secondly, you can have undemocratic Soviets and unrepublican Soviets. Republicanism is about the idea that you shouldn't have permanent subordination of one individual to another. Republican equality means the absence of relations such that A always gets to tell B what to do. Democratic republicanism is republicanism together with the rule of the majority, that it isn't a republicanism for a minority elite. Democratic Republican principles are principles which Marx and Engels took for granted because they were young men in the midst of the Chartist movement, for which these principles, democratic republicanism, were absolutely normal parts of political discourse. Then the bourgeoisie attempted to steal, well, and did succeed in stealing the word democracy for its oligarchy. And the word republicanism for its states. But that is something that we do have to steal words. I know I've had the argument with PR comrades before, and I'm sure I've had it with Jerry before. We do have to steal words. In my youth, in the early 1970s, we stole the word gay. And it stuck. We stole the word gay from the bourgeoisie. And I think we do have to steal words. And indeed, actually, we have to steal back the word socialism from Stalinism. We have to steal back the word socialism from social democracy. We have to steal back the word communism from Stalinism. In relation, therefore, to the Democratic Republic. Now, in relation to the resistance of the bourgeoisie, first, in the modern advanced Western democracies, if we seize power, therefore, a lot of the bourgeoisie as a class simply disappears, in the sense that the bourgeoisie, as it currently exists, is in substance the legal principle that directors are obliged to act in the interests of the shareholders, and the legal principle of the repayment of debt, so that money moves from institution to institution, and it's very difficult to find big capitalists. There are a few very big capitalists, but by and large, the people who represent themselves as big capitalists have basically borrowed vast amounts of money from other people in the form of shareholders, and in substance, capitalist managers. So, in the first place, there's less bourgeoisie to resist. Okay, secondly, certainly the middle classes, in the sense of the petty bourgeoisie, the small and medium enterprise sector, you will have people resisting. The primary sanction for that, it seems to me, is simply forfeiture of property. And it doesn't have to be the case that it's forfeiture of property and therefore we nationalise it. I'm not saying anyhow that we have to nationalise everything, which is essentially, this is the other thing, Comrade Dave, the Bolsheviks did not intend to nationalise everything. It's absolutely clear they didn't intend to nationalise everything. They only started nationalising things. First they put everything under workers' control. and nationalised a few things, especially the banks. They nationalised the banks in order to take control of them. But then what happened was that they put everything under workers' control, and they found there were a number of very high-profile cases where the workers, having obtained workers' control of the factories, invited buyers in and sold off the machinery, and then sold the physical factory to a speculator, and then took the money and went off to the countryside to buy land. No, there's some real cases like that, or equally the railway, where the local peasant commune, which was had in its territory the woodlands, which were the source of supply of timber for a wood-fired steam engine railway, and the peasants simply seized the wood and felled it, and cleared it and divided the land among the peasantry, with the result that the railway was shut down and there was no communication. Okay, it's as a result of, these are not universal, this is not something that's happening universally, but essentially the Bolsheviks decide to go to nationalisation and one-man management, which is a deal with the former managers, the Spetsy, as a result of anarchistic disruption of production in winter 1917-18. We are in a different situation, because who the hell would imagine in this country that they could wander off into the countryside and start farming? It's a difference. It is essentially the social ascendancy of the peasantry produces the failure of workers' control and workers' government. And they go for a deal with the urban petty bourgeoisie in the form of the Spetsy to manage production. Okay, so the point is they aren't setting out to nationalise everything, and the idea that they understood that taking control over the bourgeoisie meant that nationalising everything that David referred to is just untrue. So Soviets and all power to the Soviets, then my point was, the underlying point, and okay, I haven't represented it in the introduction as clearly as I think hope I've represented it in the book. There's two sides to it, one of which is this after the revolution problem. In the after the revolution problem, the problem is that the Soviet is unrepresentative of the working class as a class. In the making the revolution problem, the problem is, why was there a Congress of Soviets in October 1917? Anybody know? The answer is because the provisional government called it. The provisional government called it, and the Congress of Soviets before, which the Mensheviks and SRs comfortably won, because they were confident that they had a majority in it. They were wrong. In Germany and Austria, on the other hand, the social democracy absolutely opposed the construction of any national conference of the Räte and so on and so forth, of the councils, because they saw what had happened in Russia. The underlying problem is that power is actually seized by a party or by a coalition of parties. Power is actually seized by a party or coalition of parties. In the case of Russia, power is seized by a coalition of the Bolsheviks and the left SRs and the anarchists, with passive support from the Menshevik internationalists. They seize it in the name of the Congress of Soviets, which is about to meet. If they'd waited for the Congress of Soviets, which was about to meet, Kerensky would have had time to get his loyal regiments into Petrograd, and the British Armoured Car Regiment, which was waiting to be brought in as well, to suppress the Bolsheviks and the insurrectionists. So it was actually seized by a party, and then the government which is created is first a Bolshevik government and then a coalition government of the Bolsheviks and the left SRs, again with passive support from the Menshevik internationalists. The failure in Germany and the failure in Austria is because the parties of the social democracy retained control. And there was no real serious left opposition party. There was no alternative to the SPD. That was reflected in the decision of the USPD to say, well, the SPD is the majority party of the working class, so the SPD has to form the government. That was a pacifistic and stupid decision, but it nonetheless reflected the fact that the national coordination of decision-making is what's called for in a revolutionary crisis. And it can only be provided by parties. And that takes us back to the question of inner-party democracy. Because the reality is that the parties, the organisation of the state will inevitably be in the image of the parties. It's not of a new state, the creation of a new state is a party state, unavoidably. And that means that we cannot just hook it and say, okay, we have one form for the battle against the bourgeoisie and then we're going to have democracy afterwards. We need political democracy in the party in order to overthrow the bourgeoisie. And actually we need, this is the other side of it, with relation to the labour bureaucracy. We need to hang a few trade union leaders pour encourager les autres, in order to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Hang is
A metaphor.
Metaphor. So I have experienced car workers chasing shop stewards who've done something they disapproved of around the car plant with a rope. It was a noose. It's a metaphor. We need to overthrow the bureaucracy, the labour bureaucracy. We need to address the question, it's paradox. We need to address the question of how to rule, how the working class can rule, which means through democratic republican political forms, in my opinion, in order to get to the point of being able to overthrow the capitalist class. Now, I'm sorry, I've spent quite a lot of time on that one point.
Is that one point?
Yes, I mean, it was Soviets. It's most of the points that people's raised, and I think it addresses just the one thing that Dave raised on what's my attitude to the Bolsheviks. My attitude to the Bolsheviks is that it was entirely correct and justified to try and start the German Revolution in Petersburg. Yeah. That was a wholly justified gamble. And that the decisions of the Kautsky and Mottobauer and co not to are essentially, they're justified on the basis, okay, the relationship of forces within Germany isn't good enough. Kautsky says, if we do this, the Allies will intervene. But at the very moment when he's saying this, British troops are mutinying on the streets of London on the demand that they shouldn't be sent to Russia. Otto Bauer says, if we attempt to seize power, the Italians' troops will intervene. But, we are not, at the time when he's saying this, we're only 4 or 5 months away from the great wave of the occupation of the factories in Italy. And the reality is that the revolution, and this is back to Jerry's point earlier, the revolution will be international in character. It will be international. It will not be the case that uneven development results in revolutions years apart. Revolutions will be international in character within months, or they will fail. And that is actually what happened to the Russian Revolution, because it did not succeed in triggering the German Revolution. Already by spring 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk led the Bolsheviks to lose their majority. And they got round that in summer 1918 by rigging elections and suppressing parties and pretending that they had a majority when they didn't have a majority. And from then on, they've started on the path which leads down the road to the ban on factions, which leads down the road to the Cheka. Well, they invented the Cheka, etc., etc., etc. So the international character of the revolution is perhaps, I think, the most central point which I've got to make in this book, and in relation to the Russian Revolution and in relation to all the other issues. So I'm sure I've missed a number of points that comrades have made, but I don't want to run on any longer.